Chapter 12 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 6, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 12, Seward and Chase. Mr. Seward and Mr. Chase became at an early day, and continue to be, respectively, the representatives in the Cabinet of the more conservative and the more radical elements of the Republican party. Each exerted himself with equal zeal and equal energy in the branch of the public service committed to his charge, but their relative attitudes towards the President soon became entirely different. Mr. Seward, while doing everything possible to serve the national cause, and thus unconsciously building for himself an enduring monument in the respect and regard of the country, was, so far as can be discerned, absolutely free from any ambition or afterthought personal to himself. He was, during the early part of the war, so intent upon the work immediately in hand that he had no leisure for political combinations, and later, when the subject of the next presidential nomination began to be considered and discussed, he recognized the fact that Mr. Lincoln was best qualified by his abilities, his experience, and his standing in the country to be his own successor. The attitude of Mr. Chase was altogether unlike this. As we have seen, he did all that man could do to grapple with the problem of supplying the ways and means of the gigantic war. With untiring zeal and perfect integrity, he devoted his extraordinary ability to the work of raising the thousands of millions expended in the great struggle, which was crowned with a colossal success. But his attitude towards the President, it is hardly too much to say, was one which varied between the limits of active hostility and benevolent contempt. He apparently never changed his opinion that a great mistake had been committed at Chicago, and the predominant thought which was present to him through 3 years of his administration was that it was his duty to counteract, as far as possible, the evil results of that mistake. He felt himself alone in the Cabinet. He looked upon the President and all his colleagues as his inferiors in capacity, in zeal, in devotion to liberty and the general welfare. He sincerely persuaded himself that every disaster which happened to the country happened because his advice was not followed, and that every piece of good fortune was due to his having been able, from time to time, to rescue the President and the rest of the Cabinet from the consequences of their own errors. He kept up a voluminous correspondence with friends in all sections of the country, to which we should hesitate to refer had it not been that he retained copies of his letters, and many years afterwards gave them into the hands of a biographer for publication. These letters are pervaded by a constant tone of slight and criticism towards his chief and his colleagues. He continually disavows all responsibility for the conduct of the war. In one letter he says, "Since the incoming of General Halleck, I have known but little more of the progress of the war than any outsider. I mean so far as influencing it goes. My recommendations before he came in were generally disregarded, and since have been seldom ventured. I hope for the best. Those who reject my counsels ought to know better than I do." To Senator Sherman he wrote, "The future does not look promising to me, though it may be brighter than it seems to be. Since General Halleck has been here, the conduct of the war has been abandoned to him by the President almost absolutely. We, who are called members of the Cabinet, but are in reality only separate heads of departments, meeting now and then for talk on whatever happens to come uppermost, not for grave consultation on matters concerning the salvation of the country, we have as little to do with it as if we were the heads of factories supplying shoes or clothing. No regular and systematic reports of what is done are made, I believe, even to the President. Certainly none are made to the Cabinet. Of course we may hope the best. That privilege always remains. It is painful, however, to hear complaints of remissness, delays, discords, dangers, and feel that there must be ground for such complaints, and know at the same time that one has no power to remedy the evils complained of, and yet be thought to have. To another he said, "Though charged with the responsibility of providing means for the vast expenditures of the war, I have little more voice in its conduct than a stranger to the administration; perhaps not so considerable a voice as some who are in law, at least strangers to it. I should be very well satisfied with this state of things if I saw the war prosecuted with vigor and success. I am only dissatisfied with it because I cannot help thinking that if my judgment had more weight it would be so prosecuted." His letters in this strain are innumerable. In all of them he labors to keep himself distinct and separate from the rest of the government, protesting against its faults and errors, and taking credit for the good advice he wastes upon them. He says, "We have fallen on very evil days. Under the influence of a short-sighted notion that the old Union can be reconstituted after a year's civil war of free states and slave states, just as it was, the President has hitherto refused to sanction any adequate measure for the liberation of the loyal population of the South from slavery to the rebels. Hence we are fighting rebellion with one hand, and with the other supplying its vital elements of strength. Then we have placed and continued in command generals who have never manifested the slightest sympathy with our cause, as related to the controlling question of slavery. These naturally have never been more than half in earnest, and instead of their being impelled to the most vigorous action, their influence has been suffered to paralyze, in a great degree, the activity of the administration. In addition to this, there has been enormous waste and profusion growing out of high pay and excessive indulgence. All these causes tend to demoralization, and we are demoralized. I cannot go into particulars, but the instances abound. It is some consolation to me that my voice and, so far as opportunity has allowed, my example has been steadily opposed to all this. I have urged my ideas on the President and my associates till I begin to feel that they are irksome to the first, and to one or two at least of the second." All this time, with the most facile self-deception, he believed in his own loyalty and friendship for the President, and used to record in his diary his sorrow for Mr. Lincoln's fatal course. September 12, he writes, "The Secretary of War informed me that he had heard from General Halleck that the President is going out to see General McClellan, and commented with some severity on his humiliating submissiveness to that officer. It is indeed humiliating, but prompted, I believe, by a sincere desire to serve the country. I think that the President, with the most honest intentions in the world, and a naturally clear judgment and a true unselfish patriotism, has yielded so much to border state and negrophobic counsels that he now finds it difficult to arrest his own descent towards the most fatal concessions. He has already separated himself from the great body of the party which elected him, distrusts most those who represent its spirit, and waits for what?" He says in another place, September 11, "How singularly all our worst defeats have followed administrative blunders. McDowell defeated at Bull Run because the administration would not supersede Patterson by a general of more capacity, vigor, and devotion to the cause. McClellan defeated at Richmond because the administration recalled Shields and forced Fremont to retire from the pursuit of Jackson. Pope defeated at Bull Run because the administration persisted in keeping McClellan in command of the Army of the Potomac. He never lost an opportunity for ingratiating himself with the general in favor or the general in disgrace. He paid equally assiduous homage to the rising and the setting sun. In the dawn of McClellan's first successes in the West, he made haste to write to him: "The country was indebted to me in some considerable degree for the change of your commission from Ohio into a commission of Major General of the Army of the Union, and your assignment to the command of the Department of the Ohio. I drew with my own hand the order extending it into Virginia. It was my wish that you should remain in command on the Mississippi, but in this I was overruled." His present command, however, he says, is a more important one, and he wishes Kentucky and Tennessee to be included in it, and thinks both will be done. When McClellan was appointed General in Chief, the Secretary, eager to be first to tell the good news, immediately wrote a note to Colonel Key, McClellan's judge advocate: "McClellan is Commander in Chief. Let us thank God and take courage." To newly appointed and promoted generals he wrote in the same strain. Even when he had become estranged from a prominent officer, the slightest appeal to his amour propre was sufficient to bring about a reconciliation. After he had lost all confidence in McClellan and almost given up the President for not dismissing him, General John Cochrane came to him and said McClellan would like to retire from active command if he could do so without disgrace, which could be accomplished and a more active general secured by restoring him to the chief command, where he would now act in unison with myself, says the Secretary. He entered at once into pourparlers, saying how much he had once admired and confided in McClellan, how the general came to lose his confidence, how heartily he had supported him with supplies and reinforcements, notwithstanding his mistrust, his entire willingness to receive any correction which facts would warrant, his absolute freedom from personal ill will. When Cochrane told him that Colonel Key had often expressed his regret that McClellan had not conferred and acted in concert with the Secretary, he replied, "I think if he had, that the rebellion would be ended now." Further letters followed between them, which are recorded in his diary, but during these platonic negotiations McClellan was finally removed from command. Mr. Chase cultivated, however, the closest relations with those generals who imagined they had a grievance against the administration. He took General Shields to his arms when he returned from the Shenandoah after his disastrous experience with Jackson. Shields's account of how he would have destroyed Stonewall Jackson if the President had permitted him did not apparently touch the Secretary's sense of humor. He received it all in good faith, assured Shields that if he had had his way he should have been supported, and wrote in his diary, "Sad, sad, yet nobody seems to heed." General Shields and I talked all this over, deploring the strange fatality which seemed to preside over the whole transaction. He dined with us, and after dinner rode out. To Hooker, after the failure of the Chickahominy campaign, he said, "General, if my advice had been followed, you would have commanded the army after the retreat to James River, if not before." To which Fighting Joe of course responded, "If I had commanded, Richmond would have been ours." He warmly sympathized with General Hunter after the revocation of his emancipation order in South Carolina, and allowed his preference for military emancipation to carry him, in one instance, to the point of absolute disloyalty to the President. On the 31st of July, 1862, he wrote a long letter to General Butler in New Orleans, striving to controvert the views of the President in relation to slavery in the Gulf States, and urging in place of them his own opinions, to which, he said, "I am just as sure the masses will and the politicians must come, as I am sure that both politicians and masses have come, to opinions expressed by me, when they found few concurrents." And he continued his letter with this rash and mischievous advice: "Of course, if some prudential consideration did not forbid, I should at once, if I were in your place, notify the slaveholders of Louisiana that henceforth they must be content to pay their laborers' wages. It is quite true that such an order could not be enforced by military power beyond military lines, but it would enforce itself by degrees a good way beyond them, and would make the extension of military lines comparatively quite easy. Here the obvious objection presented itself that such a course would be in direct contravention to the President's known policy, and would be immediately repudiated and revoked by him. The Secretary foresaw this, and added a prediction so reckless and so disloyal to his constitutional chief that if it were not printed by undoubted authority, it would be difficult to believe he had written it. It may be said that such an order would be annulled. I think not. It is plain enough to see that the annulling of Hunter's order was a mistake. It will not be repeated. A volume could not more clearly show the Secretary's opinion of the President. The surest way to his confidence and regard was to approach him with conversation derogatory to Mr. Lincoln. He records in his diary an after-dinner conversation with an officer whom he seems to have met for the first time. I then asked what he thought of the President. He apparently had no perception of the gross impropriety of such a question coming from him. The officer evidently knew what sort of reply was expected. He said, "A man irresolute, but of honest intentions, born a poor white in a slave state, and of course among aristocrats, kind in spirit, and not envious, but anxious for approval, especially of those to whom he has been accustomed to look up. Hence solicitous of support of the slaveholders in the border states, and unwilling to offend them, without the large mind necessary to grasp great questions, uncertain of himself, and in many things ready to lean too much on others." Of course, after a dictum so thoroughly in harmony with his own opinions, the Secretary naively records that he found this gentleman well read and extremely intelligent. In reply to a correspondent whose letters were filled with the most violent abuse of the President and other officers of the Government, he had no word of rebuke. He simply replied, "I am not responsible for the management of the war, and have no voice in it, except that I am not forbidden to make suggestions, and do so now and then when I can't help it." He had no defense for his colleagues against the attacks of his correspondent, except to say, "Nor should you forget that a war managed by a president, a commanding general, and a secretary cannot, especially when the great differences of temperament, wishes, and intellectual characteristics of these three are taken into account, reasonably be expected to be conducted in the best possible manner. This condition can only be remedied by the President, and as yet he fears the remedy most." The President was not unaware of this disposition of his Minister of Finance towards him. Presidents, in even a greater degree than kings, are kept informed of all currents of favor and hostility about them; for, besides being to an equal degree the source of honors and of power, they are not encompassed by any of that divinity which hedges the hereditary ruler, and they are compelled to listen to the crude truth from the hundreds of statesmen and politicians who surround them. And besides this, the Secretary of the Treasury was a man too direct and too straightforward to work in the darkness. He records in his diary a singular conversation which he held with Thurlow Weed, an intimate and trusted counselor of the President and the bosom friend of the Secretary of State. Weed called, and we had a long talk. I told him I did not doubt Mr. Seward's fidelity to his ideas of progress, amelioration, and freedom, but that I thought he adhered too tenaciously to men who proved themselves unworthy and dangerous, such as McClellan; that he resisted too persistently decided measures; that his influence encouraged the irresolution and inaction of the President in respect to men and measures, although personally he was as decided as anybody in favor of vigorous prosecution of the war, and as active as anybody in concerting plans of action against the rebels. There is no doubt that Mr. Weed would consider it his duty to communicate to his friends this disparaging view entertained of them by the Secretary of the Treasury. Indeed, the context shows that this was expected, and when we consider that Mr. Chase talked and wrote in this strain to hundreds of people in regard to his associates, it is likely that they were as thoroughly aware of his opinions and utterances as if he had made them in cabinet meeting. But Seward was, as the President once said of him, a man without gall, and it was the lifelong habit of Mr. Lincoln to disregard slights that were personal to himself. He had the greatest respect and admiration for Mr. Chase's capacity. He believed thoroughly in his devotion to the national cause, and seeing every day the proof of his pure and able management of the finances of the government, he steadily refused to consider the question of the Secretary's feelings towards himself. It was near the end of the year 1862 that an incident occurred which threatened for a time to deprive the government of the services of the Secretaries both of State and of the Treasury. A strong feeling of discontent, gradually ripening into one of hostility, had grown up in the Senate against Mr. Seward. It was founded principally upon the ground formulated by Mr. Chase in his interview with Weed, that he adhered too tenaciously to men who proved themselves unworthy and dangerous, such as McClellan, that he resisted too persistently decided measures, and that his influence encouraged the irresolution and inaction of the President in respect to men and measures. And Mr. Sumner, who had up to this time been rather friendly than otherwise to Mr. Seward, was suddenly brought into sympathy with his opponents by discovering in the diplomatic correspondence a phrase bracketing together the secessionists and the extreme anti-slavery men for equal condemnation and criticism. The feeling against the Secretary of State at last attained such a height in the Senate that a caucus was called to consider the matter, which resulted in a vote being taken demanding of the President the dismissal of Mr. Seward from his Cabinet. As a matter of taste and expediency, this resolution later in the evening was withdrawn, and another adopted in its place, requesting the President to reconstruct the Cabinet, in which, although Mr. Seward's name was not mentioned, the intention of the Republican senators remained equally clear. A committee was appointed to present the sense of the caucus to the President, but before this was carried into effect, Senator Preston King of New York, meeting the Secretary of State, acquainted him with these proceedings, and he, with his son, the Assistant Secretary of State, at once offered their resignations to the President. On the morning of the 19th of December, a committee of 9 waited upon the President and presented him the resolutions adopted the day before. A long and earnest conference took place between the President and the committee, which was marked on both sides by unusual candor and moderation. They, one by one, attacked the Secretary of State, not for any specific wrongdoing, but for a supposed lukewarmness in the conduct of affairs, and especially for a lack of interest in the anti-slavery measures of the administration, which they considered essential to a successful prosecution of the war. When the President reported this conference to his Cabinet afterwards, he said, in his own peculiar imagery, "While they seemed to believe in my honesty, they also appeared to think that when I had in me any good purpose or intention, Seward contrived to suck it out of me unperceived." The conference ended without other result than an appointment for the committee to call again in the evening. Lincoln at once called the Cabinet together and laid the entire matter before them. He gave them distinctly to understand that in this proceeding he was not inviting or intimating that he desired the resignation of any of them. He said he could not afford to lose any of them, that he did not see how he could get on with a Cabinet composed of new material, and he dismissed the council with a request that they also should meet him that evening. The committee and the Cabinet, Seward of course being absent, came together in accordance with the President's instructions, and each party was greatly surprised to find the other there. He was determined, however, to have a thorough and frank discussion, so that hereafter, neither in his government nor in the Senate, should it be possible to say that there were any points between them concealed or unexplained. The President stated the case and read the resolutions of the senators, commenting upon parts of it with some gentle severity. A general discussion then took place, marked with singular frankness, both in the attack and the defence, Collamer and Fessenden speaking with more mildness than the others, but Grimes, Sumner, and Trumbull attacking the cabinet generally, and Mr. Seward particularly, with considerable sharpness. The cabinet defended themselves in general, and their absent colleague with equal energy, but with unruffled temper. Mr. Chase alone seemed to feel himself in a false position. As we have seen in his interview with Weed, he was in the habit of using precisely the same expressions in regard to the Secretary of State as those employed by the senators. Brought to bay thus unexpectedly, and summoned to speak before both parties to the controversy, he naturally felt the embarrassment of the situation. He could not join the Senate in their attack upon the administration, and he could not effectively defend his colleagues in the presence of 8 senators, to all of whom he had probably spoken in derogation of the President and the Secretary of State. He protested with some heat against the attitude in which he was placed, and said he would not have come if he had expected to be arraigned. When the fire of the discussion had burned itself out, Mr. Lincoln took a formal vote. "Do you, gentlemen," he said, "still think Seward ought to be excused?" Grimes, Trumbull, Sumner, and Pomeroy said yes. Collamer, Fessenden, and Howard declined to commit themselves. Harris was opposed to it, and Wade was absent. The meeting broke up late at night, says Secretary Welles, in a milder spirit than it met. The free talk had cleared the air somewhat, and both parties to the controversy respected each other more than before. As the senators were retiring, Mr. Trumbull paused for a moment at the door, then, turning, walked rapidly back to the President, and said to him privately, but with great vehemence, that the Secretary of the Treasury had held a very different tone the last time he had spoken with him. The news of this stormy meeting quickly transpired, and the next morning there was great discussion and excitement in the town. The resignation of Seward was regarded as irrevocable, and all the amateur cabinet makers were busy in the preparation of a new administration. The hopes of all the enemies of the government were greatly stimulated by this indication of divided counsels, and the partisans of General McClellan in particular thought they saw in this conjuncture the occasion for his return to power. In fact, they felt so sure of his speedy restoration to command that they began to stipulate as the price of their adhesion to him that he should dictate his own terms on his return, that he must insist upon the disposal of all the important commands in the army. They imagined that the President would be so helpless that the friends of McClellan might demand any terms they thought good. The President, though deeply distressed at the turn which affairs had taken, preserved his coolness and kept his own counsel. On the morning of the 20th, in the presence of several other members of the Cabinet who had called for further discussion of the crisis, the Secretary of the Treasury tendered his resignation. He held the written paper in his hand, but did not advance to deliver it. The President stepped forward and took it with an alacrity that surprised, and it must be said disappointed, Mr. Chase. He then at once dismissed the meeting. He afterwards said that from the moment when he saw Mr. Chase holding his resignation in his hand, his way was clear before him. He immediately sent an identical note to the Secretary of the Treasury and the Secretary of State, saying, "You have respectively tendered me your resignations as Secretary of State and Secretary of the Treasury of the United States. I am apprised of the circumstances which may render this course personally desirable to each of you, but after most anxious consideration, my deliberate judgment is that the public interest does not admit of it. I therefore have to request that you will resume the duties of your departments respectively." The next morning Mr. Seward addressed a brief note to the President, dated at the Department of State, saying, I have cheerfully resumed the functions of this department in obedience to your command, and enclosed a copy of this note to the Secretary of the Treasury. Mr. Chase found his position not quite so simple as that of the Secretary of State. He did not follow Mr. Seward's example in returning to the Cabinet as promptly as he did in leaving it. He wrote him a brief letter saying, "I have received your note and also a call from Mr. Nicolay, to whom I have promised an answer to the President tomorrow morning. My reflections strengthen my conviction that being once more honorably out of the Cabinet, no important public interest now requires my return to it. If I yield this judgment, it will be in deference to apprehensions which really seem to me unfounded. I will sleep on it." He had seen in the face of the President the gratification which the tender of his resignation had imparted, and returning to his house, while not entirely comprehending what had happened, he seemed conscious that he had made a misstep. He wrote a letter to the President, from which we take a few paragraphs. "Will you allow me to say that something you said or looked when I handed you my resignation this morning made on my mind the impression that, having received the resignations both of Governor Seward and myself, you felt that you could relieve yourself from trouble by declining to accept either, and that this feeling was one of gratification." He then went on to say that he was glad of any opportunity to promote the comfort of the President, but that he did not desire him to decline accepting his resignation. He said, "Recent events have too rudely jostled the unity of your Cabinet and disclosed an opinion too deeply seated and too generally received in Congress and in the country to be safely disregarded, that the concord in judgment and action essential to successful administration does not prevail among its members. By some, the embarrassment of administration is attributed to me, by others to Mr. Seward, by others still to other heads of departments. Now, neither Mr. Seward nor myself is essential to you or to the country. We both earnestly wish to be relieved from the oppressive charge of our respective departments, and we have both placed our resignations in your hands." He concluded by saying he thought both himself and Mr. Seward could better serve the country at that time as private citizens than in the Cabinet. He did not immediately transmit this letter to the President, and after hearing from Mr. Seward that he had gone back to the Cabinet, his suggestion that both would better retire was no longer practicable. After a Sunday passed in very serious consideration, he resolved to withdraw his resignation. He was unable even then to imitate the brevity of Mr. Seward's note. He sent to the President his note of the 20th, enclosed in another, in which he said that reflection had not much, if at all, changed his original impression, but that it had led him to the conclusion that he ought in this matter to conform his action to the President's judgment. He would therefore resume his post as Secretary of the Treasury, ready, however, to retire at any moment if, in the President's judgment, the success of the administration might be in the slightest degree promoted thereby. The untrained diplomatist of Illinois had thus met and conjured away, with unsurpassed courage and skill, one of the severest crises that ever threatened the integrity of his administration. He had to meet it absolutely unaided. From the nature of the case, he could take no advice from those who were nearest him in the government. By his bold and original expedient of confronting the Senators with the Cabinet, and having them discuss their mutual misunderstandings under his own eye, he cleared up many dangerous misconceptions, and, as usually happens when both parties are men of intelligence and goodwill, brought about a friendlier and more considerate feeling between his government and the Republican leaders than had ever before existed. By placing Mr. Chase in such an attitude that his resignation became necessary to his own sense of dignity, he made himself absolute master of the situation. By treating the resignations and the return to the Cabinet of both ministers as one and the same transaction, he saved for the nation the invaluable services of both, and preserved his own position of entire impartiality between the two wings of the Union party. The results of this achievement were not merely temporary. From that hour there was a certain loosening of the hitherto close alliance between Mr. Chase and the Republican opposition to the President, while a kind of comradeship born of their joint sortie and re-entrance into the government gave thereafter a greater semblance of cordiality to the relations between the Secretaries of State and of the Treasury. But above all, the incident left the President seated more firmly than ever in the saddle. When the Cabinet had retired and the President remained with the resignation of Mr. Chase in his hands, he said to a friend who entered soon after in one of those graphic metaphors so often suggested to him by the memories of his pioneer childhood, and which revealed his careless greatness perhaps more clearly than his most labored official utterances, "Now I can ride. I have got a pumpkin in each end of my bag." Nearly a year later he said in a conversation relating to this matter, "I do not see how it could have been done better. I am sure it was right. If I had yielded to that storm and dismissed Seward, the thing would all have slumped over one way, and we should have been left with a scanty handful of supporters. When Chase gave in his resignation, I saw that the game was in my hands, and I put it through." Though the opposition to Mr. Seward did not immediately come to an end, it never exhibited such vitality again, and its later manifestations were treated far more cavalierly by Mr. Lincoln. He had even before this dismissed one very respectable committee from New York who had called to express an unfavorable opinion of the Premier by saying with unwonted harshness that they would be willing to see the country ruined if they could turn out Seward. And after this incident he never again allowed the Secretary of State to be attacked with impunity in his presence. End of chapter 12.
Chapter 13 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 6, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 13. Perryville and Murfreesboro. About midsummer of 1862, the Confederates disposed of their strongest forces and exhibited their greatest energy along the entire line of operations from the Atlantic coast to the region west of the Mississippi. Larger armies than they were ever again able to raise made head against McClellan in Virginia, opposed Morgan at Cumberland Gap, Buell in Middle Tennessee, and Grant on the northern border of Mississippi. Nowhere did the Union armies make any considerable impression upon the strongly held Confederate lines. If there was one object dearer to the heart of the President than any other, it was the occupation of East Tennessee and the liberation of the loyal population of that region from a peculiarly cruel and galling tyranny. This object he had constantly pressed upon the attention of General Halleck, who had in turn urged it upon General Buell. After Halleck had been transferred to Washington to take command of the army, he still persistently kept the President's wishes before the eyes of the commander of the Army of the Cumberland. Buell was not lacking either in ability or any other soldierly quality, but he never seemed to appreciate the vast importance of the movement which the government was thus constantly crowding upon his attention. At least, the difficulties in the way of its accomplishment were to him so much more evident than the advantages to be derived from it, that he wore away the whole summer in untiring and most elaborate preparations for a march, for which he never got ready. The difficulties were undeniably of the most serious character. A line of discouraging length had to be constructed and defended from Nashville to the Tennessee River at Bridgeport, by which to provision the army as it advanced, and this was exposed to constant interruption from the cavalry of the enemy, at this time greatly superior to Buell's, and led by those bold and enterprising troopers, Morgan and Forrest. The summer passed away in labors and skirmishes leading to no result, until at last Bragg, by a movement of remarkable audacity, took the initiative out of Buell's hands and, by a swift and stealthy advance into Kentucky, forced his antagonist to give up all present hope of taking Chattanooga and to devote himself to the defense of Kentucky. General Bragg moved northward through Tennessee into Kentucky in the early part of September. He had previously sent General Kirby Smith with a force of 12,000 men by way of Cumberland Gap into eastern Kentucky. On the 29th of August, Smith met on his advance northward an inferior force under General William Nelson, which he defeated. Nelson, falling back to Louisville, proceeded energetically to organize a new body of troops, composed of the small garrison of that place and the newly arrived levies of volunteers and of improvised organizations of citizens. Smith came rapidly northward, occupied the city of Lexington, and threatened both Louisville and Cincinnati with strong detachments. On the 6th of September, General Henry Heth, with 6,000 troops, took position only a few miles south of Covington, the Kentucky suburb of Cincinnati. This advance produced the greatest excitement and not a little consternation throughout the West. It was Heth's belief that he could have taken Cincinnati, but this course would have been in direct contravention of Smith's orders. After a few days, Heth rejoined his chief, and on the 4th of October Smith, with all his troops in hand, reported to Bragg at Frankfort. When the movement of the Confederate forces began, General Buell was of the opinion that it would be directed against Nashville in western Tennessee, and this was doubtless the course which Bragg, if he had been wisely counseled, would have chosen. But he was beguiled at this moment with the same dream which twice led General Lee into serious trouble in the East. He imagined that Kentucky was lying in unwilling submission to the tyranny of Lincoln, and he fancied he was to effect the liberation of that state and its complete incorporation among the states of the Confederacy. Kentucky once possessed and held, Tennessee would require no further effort on the part of the Confederates to hold it securely with the South. His army took with them the means of arming the great accessions of troops which they expected from the young men of Kentucky, and the fact that he came back from this expedition with a smaller number than that with which he started was to the South one of the greatest disappointments of the war. Buell, believing that Nashville was threatened, concentrated all his available forces at Murfreesboro, and it was the 7th of September before, becoming convinced that Bragg's objective point was Louisville, the Union general set out on a race with the Confederates for that city. Bragg had, by this time, so much the start that if he had continued his march with the same energy and dash with which he began it, he might have reached the Ohio River before Buell. His advance was delayed several days at Munfordville in attempting to capture the garrison there, and on Bragg's arriving still another day was lost in parley before the place surrendered on the 17th. Buell and Thomas came up with Bragg at Pruitt's Knob. Preparations for battle were made on the 21st, but at this point Bragg seems suddenly to have changed his mind, and, leaving the direct road to Louisville, he turned to the right, stopping at Bardstown, and thus he opened to Buell the road to Louisville. Buell, seeing his advantage, pressed on with the utmost diligence. His advance reached the city on the 25th, and his army was assembled there on the 29th. General Bragg's explanation of this movement is that he found himself in the presence of the enemy with insufficient supplies, in a position where a defeat would ruin him, and even a successful battle would greatly cripple him, and that he therefore turned to the right to be nearer Lexington, Kirby Smith, and his supplies. Buell, on arriving at Louisville, found there an order relieving him from command and appointing Thomas in his place. Against this order Thomas, feeling that Buell had done his full duty in the campaign, and having the greatest confidence in his chief, and being unwilling to supersede him, protested with the utmost vehemence, and it was therefore withdrawn. Buell, with the least possible loss of time, resumed his preparations for the attack on Bragg, appointing Thomas second in command, and on the 1st of October was again in motion southward. While he was pushing out on the road to Bardstown, with no purpose but the soldierly one of finding and fighting the enemy, Smith and Bragg were going through the fantastic form of setting up a Confederate state government for Kentucky at Frankfort. All the loyal border states had provisional Confederate governments in partibus gentium. They were generally attached to the staff of Confederate commanders more or less near their titular territories. A provisional governor of Kentucky, named George W. Johnson, had been killed in the ranks at Shiloh, and his successor in that shadowy office, one Richard Hawes of Bourbon County, of the time, place, or manner of whose election there are no authentic records, now accompanied Kirby Smith. The regard for legal forms, which is innate in our race, has seldom had a more whimsical manifestation than in the inauguration of this worthy as governor of Kentucky on the 4th of October in the State House at Frankfort. He had an imposing inaugural procession. No legitimate governor was ever escorted to the Capitol by two such armies. He was sworn into office with due solemnities in the presence of soldiers from every Southern state. He even began to read a long and fervid inaugural address, full of those tropical blossoms of rhetoric so dear to the Southern mind. But the booming of distant cannons broke in upon his florid periods. His soldier audience tightened their sword belts and sprang to their horses, and Mr. Hawes' administration floated away in the dust of the marching column. The two armies came into collision on the 8th of October at the village of Perryville. It had been his intention, Bragg says, to fight at Harrodsburg, where Smith's division had been ordered to join him. But Buell's advance, coming up with Hardee's corps at Perryville, the later was obliged to halt and fight at that point. The battle was brought on by the advance of the left wing of the Union Army for the purpose of covering certain pools of water, of which the troops, thirsty with their long march, were very much in want. The three wings of Buell's army were not within convenient supporting distance of each other, and he claims that McCook, who commanded on the left, did not promptly enough report to him the extent of the assault to which he was being subjected. A fierce and destructive battle began about noon and raged until night, and it was not until 4 o'clock that Buell, being informed of the state of affairs, took measures to assist his hard-pressed left wing by detachments from the center and right. These measures, when taken, however, were effectual, and the advance of the enemy on the Union left was checked, while P.H. Sheridan, further to the right, reinforced by Colonel Carlin's brigade, charged the enemy in his front and drove him through Perryville, making considerable captures of men and arms. This charge took place at nightfall and ended the battle. The night was spent by Buell in bringing his army into position, with the intention of attacking the enemy at daybreak, but Bragg, who had been present on the field, though not in personal command of the forces, withdrew them during the night to Harrodsburg, and immediately retreated from the state. Buell pursued him, taking every precaution at each halt of the enemy to engage him on terms which they would secure a substantial victory. But whenever he was ready to advance, he found that Bragg had left him only a deserted camp. In this way he came at last to the desolate and barren country beyond Crab Orchard, where the wretched roads wound through narrow defiles, in the midst of a sparse population starving in fields already devastated by the enemy. He concluded it was useless to follow his fleet adversary further. He had driven him from the state which he had entered with high hopes of a permanent occupation. He had fought with him an indecisive battle in which he had held his own against the enemy, had pursued him with what expedition seemed possible, had made some captures of men and material, and, considering the formidable force with which Bragg had entered the state, Buell may be pardoned for thinking that his labors had met with a reasonable success, and that he might desist from pressing his troops farther. He therefore turned his heads of column towards the southwest, to resume his attitude of observation in western Tennessee, where he rightly expected Bragg would soon be found. He reported his intention to Washington, where it was not received with approval. The President, in his intense anxiety to see East Tennessee occupied by the national forces, saw no reason why Buell could not follow where Bragg could retreat. he directed General Halleck to reply with an order to Buell to move into East Tennessee. You say it is the heart of the enemy's resources. Make it the heart of yours. Your army must enter East Tennessee this fall, and it ought to move there while all the roads are passable. Once between the enemy and Nashville, there will be no serious difficulty in reopening your communications with that place. He, the President, does not understand why we cannot march as the enemy marches, live as he lives, and fight as he fights, unless we admit the inferiority of our troops and of our generals. Unmoved by this stinging dispatch, General Buell replied, with his usual clearness and calmness of statement, setting forth the difficulties in the way of his executing the President's orders. His reasons were partly military and partly philosophical. He felt that he could not call upon his troops to do what the enemy was in the habit of doing. The spirit of the rebellion, he said, enforces a subordination and patient submission to privations and want, which public sentiment renders absolutely impossible among our troops. Again, instead of imitating the enemy's plan of campaign, I should rather say that his failure had been in a measure due to his peculiar method. His tone would have been perfectly appropriate if he had been commander of the army of Laodicea, but it offered little encouragement to the President to hope for the early liberation of Tennessee at his hands. As the general had intimated, 6 days before, that the present time is perhaps as convenient as any for making any changes that may be thought proper in the command of this army, the government took him at his word, and in an order dated the 24th of October, directed him to turn over his command to General Rosecrans, thereby preparing for itself exactly a year of similar controversies and struggles, with a similar termination. Rosecrans's battle at Corinth and Buell's at Perryville were fought within days of each other. The one rendered abortive the northward movement of Van Dorn, and the other turned into something not far from ridicule the attempt of Bragg to annex Kentucky to the Southern Confederacy. But the two generals received their reward in very different fashion. Buell was removed from command, and his unquestionable talents were thereafter lost to the service, while Rosecrans was made general of the magnificent Army of the Cumberland. Having announced his assumption of command at Louisville on the 30th of October, he proceeded at once to Bowling Green, and there divided his army into 3 wings, the center being commanded by Thomas, and the right and left by McCook and Crittenden, respectively. Paying as little attention as his predecessor had done to the orders given him to march into East Tennessee, he concentrated his army about Nashville, establishing his headquarters there. His first task was to complete and strengthen his line of communications. The railroad from Louisville was soon reopened, and he occupied himself busily for a month in refitting his army and accumulating supplies. Bragg's superiority in cavalry was so great, and the raids of his bold riders, Morgan and Wheeler, were so constant, that Rosecrans, feeling himself unable to compete with him in this respect, was compelled to accumulate at Nashville supplies sufficient to render him independent of occasional interruptions. General Bragg, after his return from Kentucky, had taken his position at Murfreesboro, a short distance to the north of Nashville, and had there gone into winter quarters, expecting nothing less than that Rosecrans would follow his example. But the latter, ascertaining late in December that half of Bragg's large cavalry force had been detached, a portion against Grant in West Tennessee, and another part into Kentucky, determined to seize the occasion to march against his adversary, and if possible drive him from the state or destroy him. He marched from Nashville on the morning after Christmas, A. McD. McCook leading on the right, G. H. Thomas following by a road in the center, and T. L. Crittenden holding the left, both flanks skirmishing heavily over a difficult country much cut up by tangled forests and cedar brakes. The movement was at once reported to Bragg, who concentrated his own forces to meet it. He sent out his cavalry under Wheeler, Wharton, and Pegram to skirmish in front of the advancing army of Rosecrans, hindering its march as far as possible, and in the meantime brought together his army, consisting of Polk's and Hardee's corps, and McCown's division of Kirby Smith's corps, and strongly entrenched them in a favorable position to the north of the village of Murfreesboro. The Confederate line crossed a watercourse called Stone's River, Breckinridge's division being posted to the east, and the rest of the Confederate army to the west of the stream. Their line was also traversed at right angles by the railroad and the turnpike running to Nashville, which intersected each other at a sharp angle in front of the rebel line, and crossed Stone's River just behind it. The army of Rosecrans, constantly skirmishing, arrived in front of this line on the night of the 30th of December. The advance of his left wing, under General J.M. Palmer, had crossed the river in the afternoon of the day before, and captured a few prisoners from Breckinridge's command, but, finding the enemy in force in his front, Crittenden ordered the brigade which had crossed to return to the west side. At 9 o'clock in the evening, Rosecrans, having matured his plan of battle for the following day, called his principal commanders to his headquarters among the cedars on the Nashville Pike to receive his orders. His plan was simple, bold, and brilliant. He proposed that McCook, upon the right, should receive the attack of the enemy, or, in case he was not attacked, should demonstrate against the Confederate left, not vigorously, but warmly. Thomas was to hold the center, skirmishing and engaging the enemy's left and center as far as the river. Crittenden was to cross, advance upon Breckinridge, crush the enemy's right, and carry everything before him into Murfreesboro. When Breckinridge became dislodged, the position thus gained on the heights east of Stone's River would take the enemy's works in reverse, enabling Palmer and Thomas to advance and, in conjunction with Crittenden, to move westward of the Franklin road, thus taking the Confederates in flank and rear with every probability of destroying their army. This plan depended for its success upon McCook's being able to hold the enemy's left in check for 3 hours. Upon Rosecrans inquiring whether this could be done, McCook gave the affirmative answer, which was naturally to have been expected from his energy and bravery. He had, however, already informed Rosecrans that the right of his line rested directly in front of the enemy's center, and that he was not without some anxiety for his flank. Rosecrans accepted this information as of good omen for his movement on the left, directed McCook to build campfires upon his right to deceive the enemy and cause him still further to prolong the extension of his left. The two generals in their reports naturally disagree as to the exact purport of Rosecrans's verbal instructions, but the fact is incontestable that McCook was too little anxious as to his ability to withstand the onslaught of the Confederate left, and Rosecrans's mind was so intensely fixed on the work to be done by his left that he took too little precaution for the safety of his right. Singularly enough, on the Confederate side, General Bragg had matured a plan precisely the counterpart of Rosecrans's. This was to leave Breckinridge with one division on the east bank of the river, and with all the rest of his forces to assault the Union right at daybreak, to crush and crumble it back on the center and left, and, swinging his left around, resting his right on Stone's River as a pivot, to get to the rear of Rosecrans and cut him off from Nashville. The feint by which McCook produced the impression of the prolongation of his line was successful so far as to convince Bragg that Rosecrans was attempting to flank him on the left, but the only practical result of this was that he threw McCown's reserve division between the left wing under Hardee and the right wing under Polk, giving the former an enormous extension beyond McCook. This left him no reserve west of the river, but, imagining that Breckinridge on the east side was not threatened, he proposed to leave his troops to be used as the exigencies of the battle might determine. Never were the two generals more completely deceived as to each other's intentions. Never was a battle opened at such cross purposes as that furious fight which burst forth at dawn among the cedar brakes of Stone's River. On the morning of the 31st of December, Rosecrans's troops stood to their arms, and the left wing began to cross the river. But early as it was, Bragg had gained the initiative, And the first that the troops on the right wing of the Union army saw in the gray light of the wintry dawn were the dark columns of the enemy, flowing in a dense mass from left to right across their front, and the first sounds that greeted their ears were the roar of artillery and the rattle of musketry from the point where the heavy battalions of Hardee had overlapped and were driving in the right flank of McCook. The extreme right of McCook was held by General R. W. Johnson. On his left came J. C. Davis, and next to him a division commanded by a young officer for whom were reserved the highest fame and position, General Philip H. Sheridan. Johnson's division was struck at 6:30 in the morning by an overwhelming force of the enemy. The brigades of August Willich and Edward N. Kirk were crumbled to pieces, Kirk severely wounded, and Willich taken prisoner. The reserve brigade under P. P. Baldwin did its best, but was soon compelled to fall back. Davis's division, although in this way left unsupported, made a gallant resistance to the ill fortune which had overtaken it. Its three brigades under P. Sidney Post, William P. Carlin, and William E. Woodruff fought bravely and suffered severely, but were slowly driven back in turn, and a day of irremediable disaster seemed to have begun. It is hard to say what would have been the fate of the right wing, and with it of the army, had it not been that the commander of McCook's 3rd Division was made of such solid stuff that no hammering could affect him, and that he was able to infuse his own indomitable spirit into his entire command. For the first hour after the rout of the right flank, the fate of the Army of the Cumberland rested upon the shoulders of General Sheridan, and this tremendous responsibility was most manfully borne. Rosecrans, intent upon his movement on the left, at first paid no attention to the noise of battle on the right. To McCook's first dispatches that he was hard pressed, he simply returned an order for that general to dispose his troops to the best advantage and to hold his ground obstinately. He was inclined even to congratulate himself upon the noise of onset in that direction, inferring that it would make his work with Breckinridge easier. But a few moments later he received intelligence of the disaster in progress, and immediately suspended the movement on the left, ordering the troops engaged in it back to the west side of the river. While Sheridan was fighting his desperate battle on the ground which he still held tenaciously against the flushed and victorious Confederates, Rosecrans sent Lovell H. Rousseau of Thomas's corps into the Cedar Breaks, to Sheridan's right and rear. Horatio P. Van Cleve was hurried across the river to join Rousseau's right, and Charles G. Harker was posted further down the Murfreesboro Pike. All these troops were soon engaged with the enemy, who came pouring along the new front of the Union lines, intent upon striking the road to Nashville in Rosecrans's rear. There was no necessity for Bragg to change his plans. Although adopted in ignorance of the plan of his adversary, they worked to a marvel. Writing his report nearly 2 months later, he did not even then seem to suspect that his right had ever even been threatened, and severely censured Breckinridge for reporting that any movement had been in progress against him. Had it not been for the splendid courage with which Sheridan, Palmer, and William B. Hazen held the points assigned them, and the coolness and the determination with which Rosecrans, assisted by Thomas, exerted his utmost energies to restore his broken and shattered lines, Bragg would have won on that day the greatest of all the Confederate victories of the war. 4 times the enemy poured his serried columns upon Sheridan's narrow front, and although he lost ground gradually in these terrific attacks, his line was never broken, and the enemy paid dearly for every inch they gained. He neglected no opportunity that presented itself for an offensive return. In one magnificent charge, General Joshua W. Sill drove the enemy before him back to his entrenchments, losing his own life in this gallant feat of arms. Later in the fight, George W. Roberts was killed, and after him Frederick Schaefer's, Sheridan thus losing all his brigade commanders. At last, when his ammunition was exhausted, Sheridan, with General James S. Negley, who had also fired his last shot, fell back, still retaining the dangerous aspect of a wounded lion, through the cedar forest to the open space by the Murfreesboro pike, where he formed a new line on the right of Palmer's division. Even this frightful ordeal had not broken the spirit of his troops. In this retreat through the cedars, 2 of his regiments found a little supply of ammunition, and the moment they had attained their new position they made a fresh attack upon the enemy, clearing the timber in their front. The death of their commanders did not shake the constancy of his brigades, who still obeyed Sheridan's orders as if on parade. When the enemy had almost reached the Murfreesboro pike, George W. Roberts's brigade, which had only 3 or 4 rounds of ammunition, cheerfully went into action, gallantly charged the enemy, routing them, recapturing 2 pieces of artillery, and taking 40 prisoners. The battle raged from dawn to twilight, the line being continually repaired and reformed under the orders of Rosecrans, who this day showed his highest qualities of courage and generalship. He never for a moment lost heart or confidence. He repelled every suggestion of retreat, and flew from end to end of his line, encouraging and inspiring his men wherever he appeared. He was constantly under fire. A cannonball which grazed him took off the head of Colonel Julius P. Garesche, his chief of staff. 3 orderlies were shot down by his side. Bragg, unwilling to leave his magnificent day's work unfinished, threw his heavy battalions against the reformed Union lines again and again during the afternoon, with the greatest impetuosity, but was everywhere repulsed with heavy loss, especially on the extreme left, where Hazen held the turnpike, defending a little knoll with no rampart but his brave volunteers; in the center, where Thomas held his corps like a rock, and where the regular brigade under Colonel Oliver L. Shepard sustained a murderous assault, losing 40% of their numbers in killed and wounded, while covering the new formation of Rousseau's division; and on the extreme right, where an attack of infantry and cavalry was splendidly repulsed by Van Cleve and Harker and the cavalry. The short winter day closed in on a scene of carnage such as this western continent had, up to that time, never witnessed, but with Union lines reformed and at the last firm and defiant. Nevertheless, as evening fell, General Bragg had cause for great elation, and, in a dispatch which he sent to Richmond, he did not overstate the extent of his success. "We assailed the enemy," he said, "at 7 o'clock this morning, and after 10 hours' hard fighting have driven him from every position except his extreme left, where he has successfully resisted us." His plan had worked almost exactly as he intended. His army, pivoting upon its right, had swept over the whole field, carrying the army of Rosecrans before it, in spite of a gallant and obstinate resistance, until both hosts lay on their arms at nightfall, in lines perpendicular to those they occupied at daybreak. This conquered ground was rich in spoils of every sort, of the greatest value to the Confederates. Several thousand prisoners, 2 general officers, some dozens of guns, and hundreds of wagons and stores were among the gleanings of this opulent field; and when, in the morning, Bragg's pickets discovered that the point on the Union left, which had so stubbornly resisted the Confederates' attack the day before, had been abandoned by Rosecrans, it was not without justification that he sent to Richmond an exulting New Year's greeting, announcing, "The enemy has yielded his strong point and is falling back. We occupy the whole field and shall follow. God has granted us a happy New Year." But this was the last of his exultation and his triumph. Rosecrans had drawn in his left for reasons of his own, retiring some 200 yards to more advantageous ground. This new flank was planted firmly on Stone's River, and his already strong line made stronger by the posting of 2 good brigades, Starkweather's and Walker's, which had arrived the night before. After visiting his line from the extreme front to Overall's Creek in the rear, and after full consultation with his leading generals, Rosecrans determined to wait the enemy's attack in that position, to send for his provision trains and order up fresh supplies of ammunition, on the arrival of which, he says, Should the enemy not attack, offensive operations were to be resumed. All this while Bragg was reconnoitering the Union position and hurriedly putting his cavalry in motion to cut off the expected retreat of Rosecrans. But as the day wore on and no signs of flight were visible in the compact formation of the Union army, the Confederate general, learning his own terrible losses in the fight of the day before, became more and more disinclined to assail his antagonist in position, and on the morning of the 2nd, a new series of reconnaissances revealed to him the same result, with this disquieting addition, that Rosecrans had again occupied the high ground on the east side of the river, and was there confronting Breckinridge in a threatening attitude. This was a state of things which could not be tolerated with safety. The new position of the national troops not only threatened Breckinridge's forces, but the eminence on which they had established themselves commanded and enfiladed the line of General Polk. They must be dislodged, or Polk must be withdrawn. The latter movement, says General Bragg, involved consequences not to be entertained. He, therefore, ordered Breckinridge to attack the Union position with his entire force, and the importance of the movement was earnestly impressed upon him, the object being the protection of Polk's line and the attainment of a position from which the enemy might be enfiladed. A heavy fire was opened by Polk's artillery to occupy the Union line on the west side of the river, and Breckinridge attacked Van Cleve's division with great impetuosity, driving them down the slope and across the river. The enemy followed closely, but were received with so warm a fire by the Union artillery, and were met with such energy by 2 brigades of Nicolay's division and the Pioneer Brigade from the reserve, that their advance was at once checked, and their retreat, when it began, was soon converted into a rout with the assistance of Hazen's brigade of Palmer's division. It was a short battle, but very sanguinary, and Breckinridge's defeat was quick and complete. Night had come on, and a heavy rain was falling, and this, General Rosecrans says, was all that prevented his following the enemy into Murfreesboro. Crittenden crossed the river and entrenched himself on the heights. The next day the rain still continued, and the plowed ground between the two armies became impassable for artillery. The two hosts sternly surveyed each other, but it was evident that the initiative of the Confederate side had expended itself. The Union center had been somewhat annoyed by sharpshooters, and a swift sortie from Rousseau's division cleared the woods in his front and captured some prisoners. The reserve strength was evidently on the side of the Northern army. Bragg's forces were sinking with fatigue, with lack of rest and food. Their clothes were drenched with cold rain. A constant stream of sick and exhausted were dribbling to the hospitals in the rear. Worse than that, straggling had set in, the most ominous sign of all. The exasperating rain kept on, and the rise in the waters of Stone's River filled General Bragg with alarm. General Joseph Wheeler, coming in from the front, reported that instead of Rosecrans's retiring, there was a prospect of reinforcements coming to him. As a last discouragement, at midnight of the 2nd, after the costly repulse of Breckinridge, B.F. Cheatham and Jones M. Withers, 2 of Bragg's principal generals, had reported that there were only 3 brigades in their commands upon which they could rely, and that even these were more or less demoralized. They intimated that grave disaster might follow if they held their ground much longer. This sinister communication was forwarded by Polk, who added it to his own recommendation to retreat. "I very greatly fear," he said, "the consequences of another engagement at this place in the ensuing day. We could now perhaps get off with some safety and some credit, if the affair is well managed. Should we fail in the meditated attack, the consequences might be very disastrous." Deeply distressed, but convinced that the safety of his army required it, Bragg determined to withdraw from the field of his barren victory, and made his preparations with such skill and secrecy that he was on the march before midnight of the 3rd, and on the 5th he telegraphed from Tullahoma, unable to dislodge the enemy from his entrenched position, and, learning of reinforcements to him, I withdrew from his front night before last. He has not followed." Rosecrans learned of the retreat of his enemy the next day, and at once moved forward and occupied Murfreesboro. But, considering the start that Bragg had gained, the state of the roads, and the heavy loss of artillery horses in the late battles, he decided not to pursue. Although the fight at Murfreesboro was tactically a drawn battle, though each general failed in making the points he intended, its ultimate results justified the government and the country in hailing it as the most important victory for the Union arms. It was fought by equal forces on either side. Each general in his report naturally attributed superior numbers to his adversaries, but in truth there was little difference in the forces engaged, there being some 43,000 on each side. The Union loss was slightly greater than that of the Confederates, but the proportion of casualties to the numbers engaged on both sides was appalling. Rosecrans lost, in killed and wounded alone, 1/5 of his entire force in action, and Bragg almost as many. The captured arms and stores, though valuable to Bragg, were of little importance to Rosecrans, while the demoralization of the Confederates after the battle, as shown by the reports of Polk's division officers, to which we have referred, had no counterpart in the firm ranks of the national troops. In its wider significance and results, the advantage of the battle was entirely upon the Union side. West Tennessee and Kentucky were never again seriously threatened by the armies of the Confederacy. When, after a long delay, the two armies resumed active operations in the following summer, the ease with which Rosecrans pushed his way from Murfreesboro to Chattanooga was a result of the stubborn power displayed by the Union Army on the last day of the year 1862 at Stone's River. It must be said also that Rosecrans deserved the credit which this great battle brought him. It is true, his plan went altogether awry, but his magnificent coolness and courage in staying the tide of disaster in the morning and repulsing the victorious enemy in the afternoon, his fortitude in breasting the blows of circumstance and obstinately refusing to accept the fact of defeat, magnificently redeemed the errors of his plan and the faulty formation of his line of battle. In the midst of the gloom which the carnage of Fredericksburg had spread over the country, even the drawn battle of Murfreesboro and the consequent retreat of the enemy was a source of wide comfort and encouragement, and Rosecrans will be held to have fully deserved the warm words of greeting which President Lincoln sent him. "God bless you and all with you. Please tender to all, and accept for yourself, the nation's gratitude for your and their skill, endurance, and dauntless courage." End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 6, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 14. West Virginia Admitted. In reviewing the work of Congress and the administration during the winter of 1862, we must again take up the account of the political division of the original state of Virginia, and the formation, from a portion of her territory, of the new state of West Virginia. To do this, we must briefly recapitulate what has already been narrated, namely, that a convention of delegates chosen by the Virginia counties lying west of the great Allegheny mountain range repudiated the secession and rebellion, of which Governor Letcher was chief and Richmond the center, and formally organized the restored government of Virginia, at Wheeling, on the 19th of June, 1861. They made Francis H. Pierpont governor, who officially invoked the protection of the federal government, which President Lincoln duly promised. They constituted a legislature by calling together such members, recently chosen, as would take an oath of allegiance to the United States and the restored government of Virginia, and filled the vacancies of those who refused by new elections. This legislature chose United States senators whom Congress admitted to seats. Still further, the convention which passed these ordinances reassembled at Wheeling after a recess, and on the 20th day of August, 1861, adopted another ordinance providing for the formation of a new state, composed of 39 counties, which was to be called the state of Kanawha. An election was ordered to be held on the fourth Thursday of October succeeding, to vote upon this proposition, and also to elect delegates to a new convention, to form a constitution for the new state, which should in turn be submitted to the people within the proposed boundaries for ratification or rejection. The October election was held, resulting in a vote of 18,408 for the new state and only 781 against it. After proclamation of the result, the delegates elected met in convention at Wheeling on the 26th of November, 1861, and during a session which extended to February 18, 1862, carefully framed a constitution which included 40 counties in the new state, and instead of Kanawha, as first proposed, gave it the name of West Virginia. The Constitution, thus framed, was submitted to the people of the counties embraced in it, at an election held on the 3rd of April, 1862, when it was adopted by a vote of 18,862 for and only 514 against it. To regulate the division or juncture of states, the Constitution of the United States provides that the consent of the legislatures of the states concerned, as well as of the Congress, shall first be obtained. To meet this requirement, the legislature of the restored government of Virginia, sitting at Wheeling, passed an act, May 13th, giving its formal assent to the formation and erection of the new state within the limits of the old, and these various proceedings were laid before Congress by the senators and representatives of the restored government of Virginia, who had been admitted to seats as already related. The Senate Committee on Territories, on the 23rd of June, 1862, reported a bill to admit West Virginia, accepting all the provisions of the new Constitution except that relating to slaves, which consisted of a simple prohibition against their being brought into the state for permanent residence. In addition to this, the bill imposed as a condition precedent a system of gradual emancipation, beginning on the 4th of July, 1863. The discussions developed considerable differences of opinion among Republicans as to the legality of the various local proceedings already had and the constitutionality of the act of admission under consideration. Nevertheless, the bill passed the Senate July 14, 1862, yeas 23, nays 17. The session was so nearly at its close that the House of Representatives did not take up the question until December following. There a similar divergence of views prevailed, but, as in the Senate, a decided majority favored the measure, and the bill passed, December 10th, yeas 96, nays 55. This preliminary statement brings us to the point of special interest to the readers of this work, namely, the consideration of the bill by President Lincoln and his cabinet. On the 23rd of December, 1862, the President addressed the following note to his constitutional advisers. A bill for an act entitled, An Act for the Admission of the State of West Virginia into the Union, and for other purposes, has passed the House of Representatives and the Senate, and has been duly presented to me for my action. I respectfully ask of each of you an opinion in writing on the following questions, to wit: First, is the said act constitutional? Second, is the said act expedient? 6 members of the Cabinet answered this request with written opinions. The Secretary of the Interior, Caleb B. Smith, the 7th member, had recently retired from the Cabinet, having been appointed to a judgeship in Indiana, and his successor had not yet been named. 3 members, Seward, Chase, and Stanton, answered the questions in the affirmative. The other 3, Wells, Blair, and Bates, in the negative. Upon the constitutional point, Mr. Seward's argument, in part, ran thus. It seems to me that the political body which has given consent in this case is really and incontestably the state of Virginia. So long as the United States do not recognize the secession, departure, or separation of one of the states, that state must be deemed as existing and having a constitutional place within the Union, whatever may be at any moment exactly its revolutionary condition. A state thus situated cannot be deemed to be divided into two or more states merely by any revolutionary proceeding which may have occurred, because there cannot be constitutionally two or more states of Virginia. The newly organized state of Virginia is, therefore, at this moment, by the express consent of the United States, invested with all the rights of the state of Virginia, and charged with all the powers, privileges, and dignity of that state. If the United States allow to that organization any of these rights, powers, and privileges, it must be allowed to possess and enjoy them all. If it be a state competent to be represented in Congress and bound to pay taxes, it is a state competent to give the required consent of the state to the formation and erection of the new state of West Virginia within the jurisdiction of Virginia. Upon the question of expediency, wrote Mr. Seward, I am determined by two considerations. First, the people of Western Virginia will be safer from molestation for their loyalty, because better able to protect and defend themselves as a new and separate state, than they would be if left to demoralizing uncertainty upon the question whether, in the progress of the war, they may not again be reabsorbed in the state of Virginia, and subjected to severities as a punishment for their present devotion to the Union. The first duty of the United States is protection to loyalty wherever it is found. Second, I am of opinion that the harmony and peace of the Union will be promoted by allowing the new state to be formed and erected, which will assume jurisdiction over that part of the valley of the Ohio which lies on the south side of the Ohio River, displacing, in a constitutional and lawful manner, the jurisdiction heretofore exercised there by a political power concentrated at the head of the James River. On the question of constitutionality, Mr. Chase argued in part, in every case of insurrection involving the persons exercising the powers of state government, when a large body of the people remain faithful, that body, so far as the Union is concerned, must be taken to constitute the state. It would have been as absurd as it would have been impolitic to deny to the large loyal population of Virginia the powers of a state government, because men, whom they had clothed with executive or legislative or judicial powers, had betrayed their trusts and joined in rebellion against their country. It does not admit of doubt, therefore, as it seems to me, that the legislature which gave its consent to the formation and erection of the state of West Virginia was the true and only lawful legislature of the state of Virginia. The Madison Papers clearly show that the consent of the legislature of the original state was the only consent required to the erection and formation of a new state within its jurisdiction. That consent having been given, the consent of the new state, if required, is proved by her application for admission. Nothing required by the Constitution to the formation and admission of West Virginia into the United States is therefore wanting, and the act of admission must necessarily be constitutional. Nor is this conclusion technical, as some may think. The legislature of Virginia, it may be admitted, did not contain many members from the eastern counties. It contained, however, representatives from all counties whose inhabitants were not either rebels themselves or dominated by greater numbers of rebels. It was the only legislature of the state known to the Union. If its consent was not valid, no consent could be. If its consent was not valid, the Constitution, as to the people of West Virginia, has been so suspended by the rebellion that a most important right under it is utterly lost. With regard to the question of expediency, he writes, the act is almost universally regarded as of vital importance to their welfare by the loyal people most immediately interested, and it has received the sanction of large majorities in both houses of Congress. These facts afford strong presumptions of expediency. It may be said, indeed, that the admission of West Virginia will draw after it the necessity of admitting other states under the consent of extemporized legislatures assuming to act for whole states, though really representing no important part of their territory. I think this necessity imaginary. There is no such legislature, nor is there likely to be. No such legislature, if extemporized, is likely to receive the recognition of Congress and the executive. The case of West Virginia will form no evil precedent. Far otherwise. It will encourage the loyal by the assurance it will give of national recognition and support, but it will inspire no hopes that the national government will countenance needless and unreasonable attempts to break up or impair the integrity of states. If a case parallel to that of West Virginia shall present itself, it will doubtless be entitled to like consideration, but the contingency of such a case is surely too remote to countervail all the considerations of expediency which sustain the act. The answer of Mr. Stanton accords with his habitual positiveness of opinion and brevity of statement. The Constitution expressly authorizes a new state to be formed or erected within the jurisdiction of another state. The act of Congress is in pursuance of that authority. The measure is sanctioned by the legislature of the state within whose jurisdiction the new state is formed. When the new state is formed, its consent can be given, and then all the requirements of the Constitution are complied with. I have been unable to perceive any point on which the act of Congress conflicts with the Constitution. By the erection of the new state, the geographical boundary heretofore existing between the free and slave states will be broken, and the advantage of this upon every point of consideration surpasses all objections which have occurred to me on the question of expediency. Many prophetic dangers and evils might be specified, but it is safe to suppose that those who come after us will be as wise as ourselves, and if what we deem evils be really such, they will be avoided. The present good is real and substantial. The future may safely be left in the care of those whose duty and interest may be involved in any possible future measures of legislation. One or two extracts from the opinion of Mr. Wells will indicate the course of his argument in the negative. Under existing necessities, an organization of the loyal citizens, or a portion of them, has been recognized, and its senators and representatives admitted to seats in Congress. Yet we cannot close our eyes to the fact that the fragment of the state which, in the revolutionary tumult, has instituted the new organization, is not possessed of the records, archives, symbols, traditions, or capital of the Commonwealth. Though calling itself the state of Virginia, it does not assume the debts and obligations contracted prior to the existing difficulties. Is this organization, then, really and in point of fact anything else than a provisional government for the state? It is composed almost entirely of those loyal citizens who reside beyond the mountains and within the prescribed limits of the proposed new state. In this revolutionary period, there being no contestants, we are compelled to recognize the organization as Virginia. Whether that would be the case, and how the question would be met and disposed of were the insurrection this day abandoned, need not now be discussed. Were Virginia, or those parts of it not included in the proposed new state, invaded and held in temporary subjection by a foreign enemy instead of the insurgents, the fragment of territory and population which should successfully repel the enemy and adhere to the Union would doubtless, during such temporary subjection, be recognized, and properly recognized, as Virginia. When, however, this loyal fragment goes farther, and not only declares itself to be Virginia, but proceeds by its own act to detach itself permanently and forever from the Commonwealth, and to erect itself into a new state within the jurisdiction of the state of Virginia, the question arises whether this proceeding is regular, legal, right, and in honest good faith, conformable to, and within the letter and spirit of the Constitution. Congress may admit new states into the Union, but any attempt to dismember or divide a state by any forced or unauthorized assumption would be an inexpedient exercise of the doubtful power to the injury of such state. Were there no question of doubtful constitutionality in the movement, the time selected for the division of the state is most inopportune. It is a period of civil commotion, when unity and concerted action on the part of all loyal citizens and authorities should be directed to a restoration of the Union, and all tendency towards disintegration and demoralization avoided. Mr. Blair's argument, also in the negative, was in part as follows. The question is only whether the state of Virginia has consented to the partition of her territory and the formation of that part of it called Western Virginia into a separate state. In point of fact, it will not be contended that this has been done, for it is well known that the elections by which the movement has been made did not take place in more than a third of the counties of the state, and the votes on the Constitution did not exceed 20,000. The argument for the fulfillment of the constitutional provisions applicable to this case rests altogether on the fact that the government, organized at Wheeling, in which a portion of the district in which it is proposed to create the new state is represented with a few of the eastern counties, has been recognized as the government of the state of Virginia for certain purposes by the executive and legislative branches of the federal government. And it is contended that by these acts, the federal government is stopped from denying that the consent given by this government of Virginia to the creation of the new state is a sufficient consent within the meaning of the new Constitution. It seems to me to be a sufficient answer to this argument to say, first, that it is confessedly merely technical, and assumes unwarrantably that the qualified recognition which has been given to the government at Wheeling, for certain temporary purposes, precludes the federal government from taking notice of the fact that the Wheeling government represents much less than half the people of Virginia when it attempts to dismember the state permanently. Or, second, that the present demand, of itself, proves the previous recognitions relied on to enforce it to be erroneous. For, unquestionably, the fourth article of the Constitution prohibits the formation of a new state within the jurisdiction of an old one without the actual consent of the old state. And if it be true that we have so dealt with a third part of the people of Virginia as that to be consistent, we should now permit that minority to divide the state, it does not follow that we should persist, but on the contrary, it demonstrates that we have heretofore been wrong. And if consistency is insisted on, and is deemed necessary, we should recede from the position heretofore taken. As to the expediency of the measure, I do not think it either necessary to recede from those positions, or proper to take the new step insisted on now. There is no positive prohibition in the Constitution against the action taken by the Senate and House of Representatives in relation to the recognition of the Wheeling government, or in relation to the action taken by the executive, and all that can be said if we reject the claim of the Wheeling government to represent the people of Virginia for the purposes now under consideration will be that it admits our previous action to have been irregular. The answer to this is that if not regular, it was substantially just, and the circumstances of the case excuse the irregularity. For it was proper that the loyal people in the state of Virginia should be represented in Congress, and the representation allowed was not greater than their numbers entitled them to. But whilst it was just to the people of Western Virginia, whose country was not overrun by the rebel armies, to allow this representation, and for this purpose, and for the purposes of local government to recognize the state government instituted by them, it would be very unjust to the loyal people in the greater part of the state, who are now held in subjection by rebel armies, and who far exceed in number the 20,000 who have voted on the Constitution for Western Virginia, to permit the dismemberment of their state without their consent. The opinion of Attorney General Bates was long and elaborate, and only a small part of it can be quoted here to show the course and spirit of his argument in the negative. We all know, everybody knows, that the government of Virginia, recognized by Congress and the President, is a government of necessity, formed by that power which lies dormant in every people, which, though known and recognized, is never regulated by law, because its exact uses, and the occasions for its use, cannot be foreknown, and it is called into exercise by the great emergency which, overturning the regular government, necessitates its action, without waiting for the details and forms which all regular governments have. It is intended only to counteract the treacherous perversion of the ordained powers of the state, and stands only as a political nucleus around which the shattered elements of the old Commonwealth may meet and combine in all its original proportions, and be restored to its legitimate place in the Union. It is a provisional government, proper and necessary for the legitimate object for which it was made and recognized. That object was not to divide and destroy the state, but to rehabilitate and restore it. That government of Virginia, so formed and so recognized, does not and never did, in fact, represent and govern more than a small fraction of the state, perhaps a fourth part. And the legislature which pretends to give the consent of Virginia to her own dismemberment is, as I am credibly informed, composed chiefly, if not entirely, of men who represent those 48 counties which constitute the new state of West Virginia. The act of consent is less in the nature of a law than of a contract. It is a grant of power, an agreement to be divided. And who made the agreement, and with whom? The representatives of the 48 counties with themselves. Is that fair dealing? Is that honest legislation? Is that a legitimate exercise of a constitutional power by the legislature of Virginia? It seems to me that it is a mere abuse, nothing less than attempted secession, hardly veiled under the flimsy forms of law. Between the conflicting and evenly balanced council, the deciding opinion of President Lincoln becomes doubly interesting. Printed here for the first time, the complete document reads as follows. The consent of the legislature of Virginia is constitutionally necessary to the bill for the admission of West Virginia becoming a law. A body claiming to be such legislature has given its consent. We cannot well deny that it is such, unless we do so upon the outside knowledge that the body was chosen at elections in which a majority of the qualified voters of Virginia did not participate. But it is a universal practice in the popular elections in all these states to give no legal consideration whatever to those who do not choose to vote, as against the effect of the votes of those who do choose to vote. Hence, it is not the qualified voters, but the qualified voters who choose to vote that constitute the political power of the state. Much less than to non-voters should any consideration be given to those who did not vote in this case, because it is also a matter of outside knowledge that they were not merely neglectful of their rights under and duty to this government, but were also engaged in open rebellion against it. Doubtless among these non-voters were some Union men, whose voices were smothered by the more numerous secessionists, but we know too little of their number to assign them any appreciable value. Can this government stand if it indulges constitutional constructions by which men in open rebellion against it are to be accounted, man for man, the equals of those who maintain their loyalty to it? Are they to be accounted even better citizens and more worthy of consideration than those who merely neglect to vote? If so, their treason against the Constitution enhances their constitutional value. Without braving these absurd conclusions, we cannot deny that the body which consents to the admissions of West Virginia in the legislature of Virginia. I do not think the plural form of the words legislatures and states in the phrase of the Constitution, without the consent of the legislatures of the states concerned, etc., has any reference to the new state concerned. That plural form sprang from the contemplation of two or more old states contributing to form a new one. The idea that the new state was in danger of being admitted without its own consent was not provided against because it was not thought of, as I conceive. It is said, the devil takes care of his own. Much more should a good spirit, the spirit of the Constitution and the Union, take care of its own. I think it cannot do less and live. But is the admission into the Union of West Virginia expedient? This, in my general view, is more a question for Congress than for the executive. Still, I do not evade it. More than on anything else, it depends on whether the admission or rejection of the new state would, under all the circumstances, tend the more strongly to the restoration of the national authority throughout the Union. That which helps most in this direction is the most expedient at this time. Doubtless, those in remaining Virginia would return to the Union, so to speak, less reluctantly, without the division of the old state than with it. But I think we could not save as much in this quarter by rejecting the new state as we should lose by it in West Virginia. We can scarcely dispense with the aid of West Virginia in this struggle, much less can we afford to have her against us in Congress and in the field. Her brave and good men regard her admission into the Union as a matter of life and death. They have been true to the Union under very severe trials. We have so acted as to justify their hopes, and we cannot fully retain their confidence and cooperation if we seem to break faith with them. In fact, they could not do so much for us if they would. Again, the admission of the new state turns that much slave soil to free, and thus is a certain and irrevocable encroachment upon the cause of the rebellion. The division of a state is dreaded as a precedent, but a measure made expedient by a war is no precedent for times of peace. It is said that the admission of West Virginia is secession, and tolerated only because it is our secession. Well, if we call it by that name, there is still difference enough between secession against the Constitution and secession in favor of the Constitution. I believe the admission of West Virginia into the Union is expedient. Accordingly, on the 31st of December, 1862, President Lincoln signed the Act for the Admission of the State of West Virginia into the Union, which thereby became a law. Nothing now remained to be done except a compliance by the new state with the condition precedent which Congress had imposed. The Constitutional Convention was therefore again convened on the 12th of February, 1863, and the change duly adopted by it providing for gradual emancipation in the language which Congress had prescribed. The convention also published an address to the voters warmly recommending it, and an election held on the 26th of March, the amended Constitution was adopted by a majority of about 17,000. In conformity with the act of Congress, President Lincoln thereupon issued his proclamation dated April 20th, 1863, declaring that the act of admission should take force and effect 60 days from that date. At a supplementary election, the officers to form a new state government had been chosen, and on the 20th of June, 1863, it was formally inaugurated and West Virginia became one of the United States. The number of its counties had been increased to 48, embracing an area of 23,000 square miles of territory and containing a white population, according to the census of 1860, of 333,000 and about 12,000 slaves. The system of gradual emancipation, imposed by the act of Congress and accepted by the state, left slavery in existence in the state until it should gradually disappear by the death of those over the age of 25, by the arrival at the age of 25 of a second class, and at the age of 21 of a third class. But public opinion on this subject in West Virginia was swept along by the same causes which brought the institution to an early termination in other states of the Union. On the 9th of December, 1863, the legislature passed an act permitting owners to emancipate their slaves, and also prohibiting the bringing of slaves into the state, and declaring them, if brought in, free after 6 months. No laws on the subject were passed during the year 1864, but when the great constitutional amendment came up for action in Congress in the winter of 1864-65, West Virginia obeyed the common impulse, and on January 23, 1865, her legislature raised a joint committee of 5 from the House and 3 from the Senate to consider the subject of immediately abolishing slavery in that state. The members appear to have been ripe for a prompt decision, for on the 3rd of February, 1865, 3 days after the 13th Amendment had been adopted by Congress, an act was passed declaring 1. All persons held to service or labor as slaves in this state are hereby declared free. 2. There shall hereafter be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in this state, except in punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. The organization and admission of the new state still left in existence the restored government of Virginia, of which Governor Pierpont was the executive head. He had meanwhile removed his seat of government to Alexandria, where his authority and administration, still recognized by the President and Congress as being loyal and legal, were exercised over such portions of the remaining territory of the Old Dominion as came under the permanent control of the Union armies until the end of the rebellion. End of chapter 14.